Good morning, everyone. Today is our July month monthly meeting of Association of Physicians of India, Trichy branch. As usual, we have two topics today. One is from the dermatology and another one is from the nephrology. And we also got two speakers. One is Dr. Mani Surya Kumar, Assistant Professor of Dermatology in Stanley Medical College, and another one is our renowned nephrologist, Professor Edwin Sir, HOD of Nephrology in Stanley Medical College. And we also got TMC 1 credit hour. And this time, the Medical Council has sent one observer, Dr. Arul Sundaresh Sir. We also welcome him for observing this meeting. So we start with the physician prayer. Dear Lord, thou great physician, I kneel before thee, since every good and perfect gift must come from thee. I pray that you give skill to my hand, clear vision to my heart, and strength to my body. I pray that I will always realize that being a physician is a privilege and honor. With the simple faith of a child, I will rely on thee. Amen. I request Professor Dr. Sivashankaran sir, our chairman, to give the welcome address. Sir.
Hello to everyone. Welcome to today's session. It's my great pleasure to welcome all the members of APA and members of various associations. On behalf of APA, Trichy, I cordially welcome Dr. L. Arul Sundaresh Kumar, observer from Tamil Nadu Medical Council, and also I welcome the two eminent speakers, today's speakers, Dr. Mani Surya Kumar and Professor Edwin Fernando. Before we start, I call our secretary for minutes of the meeting, followed by session. We'll start the session.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
We'll have the minutes of meeting. Last month on June 27, Sunday, we had our monthly meeting. We had two topics. One is headache by Professor Balamurugan sir from Salem, and another one is the LFT patterns of LFT by Professor Dr. Natarajan sir, HOD of Medicine, Madurai Medical College. Since all our topics were practice-based clinical medicine, we had a lot of participants. Last time in the history of API, we had around 290 to 300 participants who attended our meeting, and till the end of the discussion, most of the participants were present. The headache discussion was very nice with all videos of signs and symptoms, but because of interrupted connectivity, we are not able to complete the discussion, but we have planned to have the discussion in the next month meeting. And regarding that hepatitis and alcohol-induced liver disorders, we had a lot of elaborate discussion with all the PGs and other consultants. So with this brief thing, we'll go to the today's session. We are welcome you for the membership of APA Trichy branch. Any assistance, you can call this number. During this meeting, if you want the credit hour to be added to your account, you have to type in the chat box the Medical Council registration number, name, mobile number, and email ID. Kindly type all these things sequentially. Don't put as separate messages. Then it will be mixed up with others numbers, and it will be very difficult. So the credit points will be added to your TNMSC account directly. And if you are not able to attend this full session, we are also recording the session, and the recording will be sent if you request it for that. And for that, the WhatsApp number is this. So today's speaker, the first speaker is Dr. Mani Surya Kumar. He is the Senior Assistant Professor, Department of Dermatology, Government Stanley Medical College and Hospital, Chennai, an experienced dermatologist. He did his MBBS and MD from Stanley Medical College. He is an active member of Indian Association of Dermatologists, Venerologists, and Lephrologists, and also is an active member of Indian Society of Teledermatology. His patience and doctor friendliness is well appreciated by all his patients. A clinician, academician, and a very good teacher. And he is also author and co-authors of many journals. I request Dr. Mani Surya Kumar to deliver his lecture. Sir, Dr. Mani Surya Kumar. Sir, unmute, sir.
Thank you, Muthamani, for the nice introduction. One second, while I'm having a small problem. Just 1 second. One second, I'll come.
Oh, no problem, sir. Take your time, sir.
Ravi, screen share out. What is
So what's the disturbance?
Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Muthumani, for the nice introduction given. A very good morning to all the physicians of the district of Trichy, a beautiful district. I take this opportunity to thank the chairman of Association of Physicians of India Trichy branch, Dr. Shivasankaran sir, and the secretary of API Trichy, Dr. L. Muthumani, for giving me this opportunity to give a lecture on itchy patient, the topic itchy patient. I'm proud to say that L. Muthumani and myself were UG batchmates in Stanley Medical College. We did our MBBS in the year 1998 to 2004. So I take this opportunity, this forum, to thank all the physicians, including Trichy, Tamil Nadu, and the entire country, all physicians and the Department of General Medicine who played a major role in the management of COVID-19 for the past 1.5 years. And we are proud of your achievement and the valiant efforts taken by the physicians in the management of COVID-19. I thank all the physicians. I take this opportunity to thank all the physicians for their management in COVID-19. Thank you. So we shall go to the topic proper, itchy patient. So how to approach a itchy patient? So itching is an unpleasant sensation that provokes the desire to scratch. Itching is the most common symptom of most of the inflammatory skin disorders. So most of the patients who come to a dermatology OPD, they present with itching. So how to approach the patient with itching? So whenever a patient comes to the OPD with itching history, you should look for primary skin lesions. Primary skin lesions could be macules, wheals, papules, plaques, vesicles, or bulla. The next major thing you should look for is whether the itching is localized or generalized. If it is localized, we could think of conditions like scabies, lichen planus, eczema, etc. If the itching is generalized, it could be urticaria, drug eruptions, erythroderma, xerosis, etc. So what if the patient is presenting with itching, but there are no primary skin lesions? Then we should think of underlying systemic disorders. So pruritus without primary lesions could be a manifestation of systemic disorder. So what are all the most common skin conditions which present with itching? Cutaneous larva migrans, scabies, pediculosis, dermatitis herpetiformis, lichen planus, urticaria, contact dermatitis, atopic dermatitis, drug eruptions, erythroderma, seborrheic dermatitis, polymorphous light eruption, fungal infections, and eczema. So I'll be dealing with the conditions in detail, one by one. So first, scabies. Scabies, as we all know, is the most common skin condition presenting with itching in any dermatology OPD. So whenever a patient comes with history of itching, nocturnal itching, especially during the night time, we should think of scabies. So we should examine the patient and look for excoriated papules, mainly involving the web space. The other sites like flexor aspect of the elbows, wrist, and axilla and genitals will also be involved. So when you combine all these points, it forms a circle, which is called as the circle of Hebra. The patient will also give a positive family history of nocturnal itching. So that is again a diagnostic point. And on investigation, you should look for the burrow. So with all these criteria, we can easily diagnose a case of scabies, nocturnal itching, family history, and the classical site of involvement. The treatment includes gamma benzene hexachloride or lindane, permethrin, and systemic drug ivermectin. Now, gamma benzene hexachloride and permethrin are applied weekly once. They are applied from neck to foot overnight, and the next day morning, we should ask the patient to take bath and wash all the clothes and the bed sheets. The dose can be repeated 1 week later. Gamma benzene hexachloride should be avoided in pregnant ladies and lactating mothers. In pregnant ladies and lactating mothers, topical permethrin can be given. The systemic drug of choice is ivermectin at the dose of 200 micrograms per kg body weight. Another dose can be repeated after 1 week. Ivermectin is especially given when there is an outbreak in hostels or in any hospital settings. So the next common condition, cutaneous larva migrans. So patients with cutaneous larva migrans will classically present with a linear serpiginous tract. So in the image which I have shown, you can see a linear serpiginous tract. The patient will give a classical history of lying on beach, sand, or any other floor without wearing a shirt. And the patient will present with itching. So you should examine for any linear serpiginous tract, which is a diagnostic hallmark of cutaneous larva migrans, which is caused by organisms like Ancyclostoma species. The treatment again includes systemic ivermectin at the dose of 200 micrograms per kg body weight. Even drugs like thiabendazole and mebendazole can be given. Here, we can give a treatment called cryotherapy. Cryotherapy is nothing but freezing technique using liquid nitrogen. So with the liquid nitrogen, you can freeze the advancing border of the cutaneous larva migrans. So the next most common skin condition which we encounter in our day-to-day OPD is dermatophytosis, also called as tinea. Dermatophytosis is the superficial fungal infection of the skin. The patient present with itching, and when you examine, you can see the annular lesions. Annular lesion, you can see in this image, a large annular lesion with a raised border. The border is raised and the center is clear. This is the hallmark of dermatophytosis. Sometimes the borders can be studded with papules or vesicles or scaling, as you see in the second image. So whenever a patient presents with annular lesions with central clearing, raised border, papules, vesicles, and scaling in the border, the diagnosis is dermatophytosis or superficial fungal infection of the skin. The management includes topical and systemic antifungals. Topical antifungals like clotrimazole, eberconazole, ceftriaconazole, and systemic antifungals like itraconazole, terbinafine, fluconazole, and griseofulvin. But the main point which I would like to highlight in the management of dermatophytosis is please don't use topical steroids. Initially, when you apply a steroid cream for fungal infection, it gives resolution, but that is because of the anti-inflammatory effect of the steroid. But what happens later is there is a localized suppression of immunity, which leads to flare-up of the lesions. So I sincerely request not to prescribe topical steroids in the management of dermatophytosis. Many over-the-counter medications are available, like combination of steroid, antifungal, and antibacterials, like the Dermify, 4-Derm, 5-Derm. Please don't use those medications in the management of tinea. Only topical antifungals and systemic antifungals. Next most itchy condition, pediculosis. Pediculosis is nothing but an itching present over the scalp. It is caused by the louse, which is called as Styrus pubis. So the patient will present with itching over the scalp, and when you examine the hair, you can look for the louse and also the nits or the products of the louse. In this image, you can see a child. Actually, this child is a mentally retarded child which was not taken care properly by the parents and the guardians, and hence there was severe involvement of the scalp. In the image, you can see multiple severe involvement of the scalp with the louse and the nits. So the treatment of, again, the patient will present with lymphadenopathy. You should examine for cervical lymphadenopathy. And the treatment again includes topical gamma benzene hexachloride, topical permethrin, and systemic drug ivermectin. Now, in the case of pediculosis, gamma benzene hexachloride and permethrin are applied weekly once. They should be applied over the scalp 10 to 15 minutes before taking the head bath. Then they have to wash the hair with the shampoo. Even ivermectin shampoos are available, which can be used in the management of pediculosis. The next common skin condition with itching is psoriasis. The patient will present with the itching, and when you examine, you can see the well-defined raised erythematous plaques. So in the image, you can see the raised erythematous plaques, the classical silvery white scaling. Raised erythematous plaques with silvery white scaling. The most common sites involved are the extensor aspect of the elbows, knees, and the lumbosacral area. And you should immediately look for the Auspitz sign. Auspitz sign is nothing but you should scrape the lesion with a glass slide. You can see the scales will get removed, and at the end point, you can see pinpoint bleeding. So that is Auspitz sign. Nowadays, psoriasis comes under a systemic condition. It is associated with systemic conditions like diabetes, thyroid, and there is severe joint involvement with involvement of distal interphalangeal joint and other joints like knee and elbows. The treatment is very difficult in the management of psoriasis. It includes topical medications like steroids, topical calcipotriol, topical tacrolimus, topical coal tar or topical diethranol, and systemic drugs include immunosuppressives like methotrexate, cyclosporin, and azathioprine. Now, the latest management in the psoriasis is biologicals, which target the TNF-alpha, drugs like etanercept, infliximab, and IL-17 inhibitors like secukinumab. Next, bullous pemphigoid. So, bullous pemphigoid is nothing but an autoimmune bullous disorder, subepidermal bullous disorder. The patient will present with severe itching, and when you examine, you can see multiple tense vesicles and bulla. The most common site involved will be the lower abdomen and the thighs. All the autoimmune bullous disorders are not itchy. Only bullous pemphigoid and dermatitis herpetiformis are itchy autoimmune bullous disorders. So whenever a patient presents with itching and multiple tense vesicles and bulla, as you see in this image, you can see tense vesicles and bulla, mainly involving the lower abdomen and the thighs, you should think of bullous pemphigoid. The next immediate step is biopsy, which is the diagnostic step in the management of bullous pemphigoid. On biopsy, you can see a subepidermal bulla. The management includes, again, systemic steroids at the dose of 1 milligram per kg body weight, and pulse therapy like dexamethasone cyclophosphamide pulse therapy can be given monthly once, and immunosuppressives, mainly azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, methotrexate. And the current biological against CD20, because the basic pathogenesis in bullous pemphigoid is autoantibodies against CD20. So the drug rituximab against CD20 is now playing a major role in the management of autoimmune bullous disorders. So patient presenting with itching, tense bulla and vesicles, lower abdomen, thighs, you should think of bullous pemphigoid. Atopic dermatitis. Atopic dermatitis is another most severe itchy dermatosis, mainly involving the pediatric age group. Patient, the baby or the child will present with severe itching. You should look for erythema, scaling, oozing, and lichenification, mainly involving the sites like the cheeks, extensor aspect of the elbows, knees, and the gluteal region. As you see in the images, you can see erythema, scaling, oozing, and lichenification, commonly involving the cheeks and the extensor aspect of the elbows and the knees. So another severe itchy condition, atopic dermatitis, it is associated with other allergic conditions like asthma, urticaria, hay fever, migraine, and anaphylaxis. The treatment, the mainstay management of atopic dermatitis is emollients. Mild topical steroids like desonide, fluticasone can be used in the pediatric age group. And when there is severe involvement like this child, you should go for systemic steroids at the dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg body weight. But the main thing, you should be very judicious in using the steroids because of the risk of suppression of HPA axis. So immediately if you start the child on steroids, slowly you have to taper the steroids and slowly you have to stop the steroids, and you can add immunosuppressive drugs like cyclosporin. So atopic dermatitis, severe itching, patient presenting with erythema, scaling, oozing, classical sites, cheeks, elbows, knees, think of atopic dermatitis. Prurigo. Prurigo is another severe itchy dermatosis. Patient will present with severe itching, which he cannot control. The most common site involvement will be the lower legs. And on careful examination, you can see the multiple hyperkeratotic papules and nodules and you can see central crusting. In this lesion, you can see the central crusting, hyperkeratotic papules and nodules with central crusting. Involving the extremities, the diagnosis is prurigo. Treatment includes topical steroids and oral drugs like dapsone and thalidomide. Polymorphic light eruption, another most common itchy skin condition. Patient will present with severe itching, mainly involving the photoexposed area. So when you examine the photoexposed areas, you can see polymorphic skin lesions like papules, sometimes even vesicles can be seen, and you can see hypopigmentation like in this patient with scaling. So mainly involving the photoexposed areas. So the main management of polymorphic light erection will be strict photoprotection and liberal use of sunscreens, physical sunscreens. Irritant contact dermatitis. Irritant contact dermatitis is another severe itchy dermatosis. Patient will have an acute onset. The patient will present with severe itching and skin lesions of 1 day or 2 days duration. The patient will give a classical history of contact with any allergen, and immediately the lesions will occur immediately. So this is the main differentiating point from allergic contact dermatitis, and the lesions will be restricted only to the site of contact, and there will be intense erythema, vesicles, papules, and in the center you can see a central necrosis. Patient will present with a severe eschar, central necrosis. Background, there will be erythema and papules and vesicles, and there will be a very short acute history, contact with allergen. Diagnosis, irritant contact dermatitis. The mainstay management will be topical steroids, and in severe cases, systemic steroids can be started. So allergic contact dermatitis closely mimics irritant contact dermatitis, but allergic contact dermatitis will be a very chronic condition. There will be history of contact with the allergen for a long duration, for nearly 10 to 15 years. Allergens could be either hair dye, cement, or any other chemical. The manifestations will be very late. In this patient, he was applying hair dye for nearly 10 to 15 years, but the patient presented with these lesions only very late, after 10 to 15 years. And first it involved the exposed area, the hair dye exposed area like the forehead. Later the disease spread to other parts of the body. So this is the differentiating point from irritant contact dermatitis. Irritant contact dermatitis will be limited only to the contact point of the allergen. But in allergic contact dermatitis, there will be a very long history, and the involvement will be even disseminated. Other parts of the body can also be involved. The management of allergic contact dermatitis, again, main management will be systemic steroids. So start the patient on systemic steroids, slowly taper the dose, and add immunosuppressives, mainly azathioprine, and liberal use of emollients. Dermatitis herpetiformis, as I previously told, it is another subepidermal autoimmune bullous disorder which presents with severe itching. It will be associated with gluten sensitive enteropathy. So we should ask the history of gluten sensitive enteropathy, like any abdominal pain or discomfort or abdominal distension following intake of food items like wheat, barley, and oats. The patient will present with severe itching, mainly involving the extremities. So in this image, you can see the involvement excoriated papules, mainly involving the extremities, and you can see tiny vesicles in the flexor aspect of the wrist. So this is highly diagnostic of dermatitis herpetiformis, another subepidermal autoimmune bullous disorder which presents with itching. The treatment, the mainstay management of dermatitis herpetiformis is dapsone. Whenever a patient presents with severe itching over the nipple areola, and on examination, if there is oozing and crusting, always think of Paget's disease. Paget's disease of the breast, which is a pre-malignant condition. So it will present with itching, oozing, crusting. It will closely resemble eczema, mainly involving the nipple and the areola. So it's another itchy condition, Paget's disease of the breast, pre-malignant condition. Immediately we should go for biopsy to look for pagetoid cells. So patient presenting with itching, eczema, oozing of the nipple and areola, always think of Paget's disease of the breast. Erythroderma is another dermatological emergency. Most of them think that there is no emergency in dermatology, but there are dermatological emergencies like erythroderma and autoimmune bullous disorders. Erythroderma, the patient will present with severe itching, and on examination, you can see erythema and scaling involving the entire body. As you see in this image, there is erythema and scaling involving more than 90% of the body surface area. So whenever a patient presents with itching, erythema and scaling involving more than 90% of the body surface area, think of erythroderma. Erythroderma, there are many causes like psoriasis, eczema, lichen planus, and even mycosis fungoides, cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. So the treatment of erythroderma will be depending upon the cause. So immediately we should go for biopsy and rule out the primary cause which led to the erythroderma. So the treatment will depend upon the primary cause. Urticaria, most common skin condition and the most difficult condition to manage in the dermatology OPD. So urticaria, patient will present with severe itching, and on examination you can see the multiple erythematous wheals. As you see in this image, multiple erythematous wheals. Patient presenting with itching and wheals, the diagnosis is urticaria. There are many causes for urticaria. It is an allergic response of the skin to various allergens like any infections. It could be infection, infestations, any drugs, even food, or sometimes it could be autoimmune or idiopathic. So whenever the patient presents with urticaria, you should ask a detailed history. You should try to find out what is the root cause for urticaria or what is the allergen. And the mainstay management of urticaria will be to avoid the triggering factor or the allergen. If it is food, for example, any seafoods or wheat proteins, you should ask the patient to avoid. So the main management is detailed history and avoiding the triggering factor. And the main management is antihistamines. Another common itchy skin condition, lichen planus. So the patient will present with severe itching. On examination, you can see the violaceous papules and plaques. Violaceous is nothing but bluish white color. So in this image, you can see a patient presenting with papules, patches and plaques. You can see the bluish white color, that is called violaceous. So violaceous papules and plaques. And on examination of the oral mucosa, there will be severe involvement of the oral mucosa, buccal mucosa, and the palate. So the diagnosis is lichen planus. So lichen planus, the mainstay management includes systemic steroids and other drugs like dapsone, methotrexate, cyclosporin, and azathioprine. So whenever a patient presents with itching, violaceous, bluish white papules and plaques, think of lichen planus. Drug eruption. Drug eruption is another most common skin condition which we encounter. The patient will give a history of taking drugs for any fever or cough or body pain. 2 to 3 days later, the patient will present with itching and a generalized rash. The rash could be a maculopapular rash or a purpuric rash. Whenever a patient presents with itching and generalized rash, always think of drug eruption. Immediately examine for the oral mucosa. There will be severe involvement of the oral mucosa or the genital mucosa. There will be erosions and crusting. And you should also look for the palms and soles. There will be intense erythema and papules of the palms and soles. So patient presenting with itching and generalized rash and giving history of drug intake 2 to 3 days or 1 week prior to the onset of rash, always think of drug eruption. The mainstay management includes immediately stopping the drug or the triggering drug and start the patient on systemic steroids and other drugs like cyclosporin. Drug eruptions are another dermatological emergency. Mycosis fungoides. You can see this patient. So it's very hard or very sad to think of such patients. Mycosis fungoides, this patient presented to our OPD with erythroderma. Again, erythema and scaling. In this patient, you can see the erythema and the severe scaling. So tight scaling. The scaling is actually very tight, involving more than 90% of the body surface area. The patient presented with erythema scaling to our OPD with severe itching. Mycosis fungoides in erythrodermas, mycosis fungoides presents with severe itching compared to other types of erythroderma. Immediately in this patient, we went for biopsy and we were able to see the atypical lymphocytes, epidermotropism and Portreous microabscess, and the patient was diagnosed as mycosis fungoides. Cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. Mycosis fungoides, how to diagnose mycosis fungoides? Patient will present with intense itching. Itching will be the predominant symptom. On examination, there will be erythema, scaling, involving more than 90% of the body surface area. The patient will be looking emaciated, hepatosplenomegaly, lymphadenopathy. You should look for generalized lymphadenopathy. And the palms and soles, you should look for erythroderma, erythrokeratoderma. You can see the keratoderma Here, keratoderma is nothing but thickening of the skin over the palms and soles. In this image, you can see the thick skin over the palms and the soles. So itching, erythema, scaling, keratoderma, lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly, always think of mycosis fungoides. We started the patient on methotrexate. We referred the patient to medical oncology, but the patient succumbed. He died. Insect bite allergy. Insect bite allergy is the most common skin condition which we encounter in the pediatric age group. The main problem in treatment of IBA or insect bite allergy is it closely resembles scabies. So whenever a patient comes with insect bite allergy, you should immediately rule out scabies. Scabies will mainly involve the web spaces and it will present with nocturnal itching. But insect bite allergy will also present with itching, but it will mainly involve the exposed site. So mainly the exposed sites will be involved and the patient will present with itching and excoriated papules and vesicles, mainly involving the exposed areas. So insect bite allergy, itching, papules, excoriated papules involving the exposed areas. So the mainstay treatment of insect bite allergy is to avoid the insects, protective clothing and usage of insect repellents, good moisturizers and antihistamines. Seborrheic dermatitis. Seborrheic dermatitis is another severe itchy condition. Patient will present with severe itching over the scalp. On careful examination, you should look for the greasy scaling. The greasy scaling with itching over the scalp, always think of seborrheic dermatitis. And you should immediately differentiate from psoriasis of the scalp. Psoriasis of the scalp will also present with itching, but the scaling will be fine. It will not be so greasy like seborrheic dermatitis. It will be fine scaling in the case of psoriasis. So seborrheic dermatitis, the treatment includes ketoconazole based shampoos, salicylic acid based shampoos, even mild steroid based shampoos, and sometimes even systemic antifungals can be started. So patient presenting with severe itching over the scalp with greasy scaling, as you see in this image, think of seborrheic dermatitis. Malaria. Malaria, as in common terms in Tamil, verkuru. Malaria, again the patient will present with severe itching and the main involvement of the body will be the covered sites due to the friction of the clothing. And on examination, you can see papules or tiny vesicles, as in this patient. You can see tiny, very tiny vesicles, mainly involving the covered parts. And underlying erythema will be present. So intense itching, erythema, papules, tiny vesicles involving the covered parts of the body, always think of malaria. The mainstay management is, again, avoiding sweating. You should avoid excessive clothing, avoid tight clothing, and we should advise the patient to be in air-conditioned rooms if he has severe malaria, and use of topical emollients, moisturizers, and antihistamines. Steatotic eczema. Steatotic eczema is another severe itchy condition. It mainly involves the lower legs, and the patient will present with dry, scaly condition, dry, scaly lesions. As you see in this image, you can see dry, scaly lesion, mainly involving the lower legs. And it resembles a parchment-like appearance. Always think of steatotic eczema. The main pathogenesis behind steatotic eczema is the loss of endogenous lipids of the skin. So dry, scaly lesions presenting with itching, involving the lower legs. Always think of steatotic eczema. You should advise the patient to avoid hot water bath, and liberal use of topical emollients and even mild steroids can be used. So till now we are seeing the pruritus conditions with skin lesions. So whenever a patient presents with pruritus but without skin lesions, always rule out systemic disorders. So what are all the systemic disorders which present with pruritus we are going to see now. So blood-related disorders. The most common blood-related disorders which present with itching includes iron deficiency anemia and polycythemia vera. So how to diagnose iron deficiency anemia or polycythemia vera with itching? The patient will classically present with itching after a hot bath. So when the patient comes out of bath, the patient will present with severe itching, and the itching will be pricking in nature. So always think of systemic disease like iron deficiency anemia and polycythemia vera. So patient presenting with itching but no skin lesion, also think of hepatic conditions like biliary cirrhosis, chronic hepatitis C infections, and even malignancies of the liver. So the patient will present with severe itching. The pruritus will be due to the bile salts and the opioid peptides. Pruritus without skin lesions, think of malignancies or tumors like Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemias, and internal malignancies, multiple myeloma. Pruritus without skin lesion, think of psychiatric conditions like delusions of parasitosis, neurotic excoriations, and psychogenic pruritus. Delusion of parasitosis. The patient will have a delusion of itching. The patient will come to our OPD with severe itching. The patient will tell, I have severe itching, but on examination, there will not be any skin lesion. The patient will try to prick the skin, and he'll the pricked skin, he'll put it in a matchbox, and he'll come to the OPD and show to you. And he'll show to you that, see the matchbox, it is full of worms. So it's a delusion of parasite. The patient will think that the parasites are moving or crawling over the body, and he'll prick the skin, and he'll think that they are the parasites or the worms, and he'll put them in a matchbox, and he'll come to our OPD and he'll show you the matchbox, which is called the matchbox sign. So delusion of parasitosis. Most common psychiatric condition, the patient will give itching, but it is not an itchy condition, it is a delusion. So again, pruritus without skin lesions, think of endocrine disorders like diabetes mellitus, hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, and carcinoid syndrome. Diabetes mellitus, many skin conditions will be associated with diabetes mellitus, but sometimes there won't be skin lesions, only generalized pruritus. So old age, patient presenting with generalized pruritus, always think of diabetes mellitus. So how to approach a pruritic patient? What are all the important history you should ask when a patient comes with pruritus or itching? We should ask whether the itching is localized or generalized. So localized skin conditions, I've told, scabies, lichen planus, eczema. If the itching is generalized, it could be drug eruption, erythroderma, xerosis. So the first history should be whether the itching is localized or generalized. Duration of itching. Again, duration of itching will play a major role, whether it is an acute condition or a chronic condition. If the patient presents with acute itching, think of infection, scabies, or if it is a chronic condition, think of contact dermatitis, allergic contact dermatitis, mycosis fungoides, other erythrodermas. So duration of itching is very important. Diurnal variation of itching. You should ask the itching whether it is more in the daytime or more in the nighttime. So nocturnal itching, if the patient presents nocturnal itching, you should think of scabies. Daytime, miliaria, the patient will present with severe itching in the daytime when there is exposure to sun and sweating. So the diurnal variation of itching, the history of diurnal variation is very important. Family history. You should ask family history of itching, especially in patients with scabies. Whether it is related to any drug or intake of drug or any intake of food. So that history is very important to rule out urticaria. And history of any travel to any other country, and a sexual history. Sexual history again plays a major role whenever a patient presents with itching. Scabies, again, scabies can present in the genitals. Patient presenting with scabies mainly involving the genital region, always think of sexual history, sexual contact. It could be a manifestation of HIV. So the patient presenting with severe itching, and on examination, you can see multiple papules all over the body, severe itching. Think of the condition called pruritic papular eruption, which is the most common initial manifestation of HIV. So immediately you should ask for a sexual history and try to rule out HIV. Exposure, again, history related to exposure to chemicals and history related to any drug intake. So these are all the most common history you should ask whenever a patient presents with itching. So coming to the management, so what are all the management options which we have when the patient presents with itching? So when there are skin lesions, when the patient presents with itching and skin lesion, treatment of the primary skin lesion is the mainstay management. So the other drugs are only supportives, like topicals like menthol, calamine lotion, doxepin, topical steroids, topical capsaicin, topical crotameton, topical pramoxine. So whenever a patient presents with itching and skin lesion, treatment of the primary skin lesion is the mainstay management. The other drugs are only an additional drugs. There are some physical treatments in the management of pruritus. Whenever a patient presents with generalized pruritus, for example, in diabetes mellitus, no skin lesions, but generalized pruritus, you can think of physical treatments like narrowband UVB and PUVA therapy. Systemic drugs, again, antihistamines, H1 antihistamines and H2 antihistamines play a major role in the management of pruritus. H1 antihistamines like chlorpheniramine, hydroxyzine, H2 antihistamines like cetirizine, ranitidine, loratadine, desloratadine. Antihistamines play a major role in the management of itching. Mainly pregnancy and lactation, always consider using H1 antihistamines like chlorpheniramine maleate. Systemic steroids, again, they play a major role in the management of most of the skin conditions like eczema, atopic dermatitis, lichen planus, erythrodermas. Steroids, systemic steroids at the dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg body weight play a major role in the management of patients with pruritus. Doxepin, tricyclic antidepressants, they play a major role in the management of psychogenic pruritus. Danazol, whenever the patient presents with the angioedema, itching and angioedema is swelling of the lips, eyelids, severe involvement of the mucosa. Think of anabolic steroids like danazol. Naltrexone, opioid antagonist, again plays a major role in the systemic management of pruritus. So thank you. Once again, I thank the API Association Trichy for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. So any questions?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, sir. We'll reserve the questions at the end of the session, sir, after the second speaker finishes his topic, sir.
Okay, sir.
Sir, 1 minute, sir. I want to introduce you, sir. I have the slides, sir. Sir, Dr. Edwin, sir.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Yes, sir. Okay. So the next topic is the nephrology topic. Actually, sir is a very known person. Before approaching him for this small topic, I was little hesitant because how to ask a legendary speaker like sir to speak a small topic like urine routing. But once I told, he gladly accepted and he said, I will talk it, nothing, no problem with that, like that. So he's an enthusiast, passionate educator. He has got the fellowship from Indian Society of Nephrology, fellowship from Royal College of Physicians, Glasgow, and fellowship from Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh. He is a member of Renal Transplantation Advisory Committee. He is a state nodal officer for hemodialysis program, scientific committee member for Indian Society of Nephrology, member of ethics committee, Government Stanley Medical College. And he is the principal investigator for this landmark trials like Credence, DAPA-CKD, and testing. He got the Award of Excellence by Government of Tamil Nadu in 2018 and 2019. His special interests were in transplantation, renal disease in pregnancy, and acute kidney injury. He is an active member of Association of Physicians of India, Indian Society of Nephrology, Peritoneal Dialysis Society of India, Indian Society of Organ Transplantation, Nephrology, Urology, Transplant Society of SARC, and Indian Medical Association. He has got more than 50 publications in index journals. He authored many chapters in books, and he had more than 200 invited talks, and he is reviewer for many journals. And with this small introduction, I request sir to take over this podium. Sir?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muthamani, for the nice introduction. And good morning to all. And I thank the API Trichy for calling me once again to talk to you on a very important topic. My respects to all the senior members of the API Trichy, Dr. Ashraf, a very good friend and a senior colleague, Dr. Sivashankaran, Dr. Muthamani. And I'm glad that I had another fellow Stanleyan faculty who spoke before me.
Thank you, sir.
And that was more interesting, and I went through, listened to the talk. Thank you, Mani. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So when Muthamani told me that I have to talk on investigations in renal disease, I said I will limit myself to urine, because this is the most often forgotten investigation by all clinicians. a patient comes to us with an MRI, but the urine examination is missing. So the urine examination is a cornerstone of clinical nephrology, and it is in fact an extension of your clinical practice. After examination of the patient, I think the first thing that a nephrologist or even a physician should do is to examine the urine. So I shall be talking about how to analyze the urine the right way. So this is what Thomas Addis, he's one of the early faculty members at the Guy's Hospital, London, who says when the patient dies, the kidneys may go to the pathologist, but he lives. When he lives, the urine is ours. It can provide us day by day, month to month, year by year, serial story of major events that take place within the kidney. And urine examination has been known for ages, way back to Hippocrates 6,000 years ago, in the 13th to 15th century, where urine was looked even by our own. We have seen our own grandmothers examine a urine when they suspect that the patient has jaundice. They themselves collect the urine and then look at it. So this is the painting of a sick lady. So you look at a physician examining her urine, the gross examination of the urine. And this is the physician, this is a painting again, where the physician looks at the urine. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I shall discuss the topic under the following headings. So before doing a urine examination, avoid strenuous physical exercise. So don't go for your morning jogging or walking and then come and give a urine in the lab. So, and in women, always avoid the menstrual time because the urine is going to get contaminated with blood, which can give the erroneous impression of hematuria or RBCs in the urine. Washing hands, wash the urethral meatus after spreading the vulva in the female and in the glans penis in the male. And collect the urine after discarding the first portion. So it's like a midstream urine. To start passing urine, insert the wide mouth bottle which the laboratory gives you to collect the urine. And always label it well. Ideal to have the second sample of urine because the overnight urine is there in the first sample that may actually favors the lysis of the urine particles. And in patients who are catheterized, always collect urine when disconnecting the urobag. Collect urine from the Foley's catheter and not from the bag, because that's going to give you erroneous results. Certain debris, infection, other materials can be collected in the urine. So please disconnect the Foley and take a sample of urine. And as far as possible, the urine should be analyzed immediately, ideally 2 to 4 hours. It can be refrigerated. Suppose the lab is a little away, 2 to 8 degrees, and then rewarmed to room temperature. Preservatives could be added, but preservatives could lead to erroneous appearance of other particles. And the first thing is to look at the urine grossly, because when somebody has, for example, somebody may come and say, my urine is like milk. So this is chyluria. Straight away, you can make a diagnosis and then proceed on other investigations for that. So a normal urine is clear. While if you look at somebody having pyuria, you could see the sample on the left, where it's turbid or very cloudy urine. It could be leukocytes, bacteria, crystalluria, or a etc. And this is hematuria, abnormal colors of the urine. This can be just hematuria, hemoglobinuria, myoglobinuria. Jaundice, where a deep colored urine, high colored urine can be mistaken as hematuria. Other rare diseases like porphyria, alkaptonuria, where the urine can stand dark or standing. And whenever a patient passes a colored urine, always ask for history of drugs. Common things being rifampin, phenytoin, chloroquine, nitrofurantoin, etc. Foods like beetroot or senna or rhubarb can give rise to these discolorations in the urine. And the other thing is the odor of the urine. So many patients would come and tell, my urine smells a lot. So this abnormal pungent of odor is caused by production of ammonia by the bacteria. Of course, there are certain things like other diseases where typical odors can give you a diagnosis. As it goes to the lab, there are various methods of looking at the urine. The first thing is the commonly used one is a dipstick. So when you are using a laboratory, you must know what is the test that is being done in our laboratory, how the urine is being analyzed, so that you can know the fallacies of the procedure or any issues that doesn't correlate clinically, you could get back to that. So this is a commonly used dipstick. So the dipstick picks up about 8 items from leukocytes, nitrates, protein, pH, etc., glucose. And when you look at the dipstick uses the principle of changes in the pH and the color. So the RBC, sometimes the blood 2+ may be found on the dipstick, but it could be a false positive. For example, hemoglobinuria can give rise to a 2+ positivity, or myoglobinuria can give rise to a 2+ positivity. So whenever there is hematuria that needs to be confirmed, of course, when you have gross hematuria, it doesn't require any great confirmation, but microscopic hematuria definitely requires a urine microscopy. So certain false negatives can also be seen in the dipstick. It could be the RBCs, as I mentioned, pseudoperoxidase, which could be positive, negative, or large amounts of vitamin C. This is concentrated urine, relative high density proteinuria, glycosuria. All this can give rise to a positive leukocyte esterase testing. The sensitivity of this test is low, whereas specificity is greater than 90%. So this will give you a clue that there is some urinary tract infection. When the patient comes in sick with the symptoms of either systemic symptoms of UTI or local symptoms, a simple urine examination can give rise to, can give you these clues, because a culture would take at least 48 to 72 hours for us to get the reports. Now, the dipstick detects albumin. Albumin is one of the proteins that is excreted. Normally, about 150 milligrams of protein is excreted per day. It can go up to 300 milligrams during normal pregnancy. The dipstick detects albumin. Albumin is one of the proteins. So please remember that. While if you want to check urine for protein, you must look at what is known as a sulfosalicylic acid test, where you take urine, add sulfosalicylic acid, then if there is a precipitation, you grade the precipitation as 1+, 2+, 3+, or 4+. So a dilute urine can give rise to a negative dipstick, and a concentrated urine can actually overestimate the degree of albuminuria. However, to quantify the proteinuria, it is always better to have a 24-hour urine protein excretion. Now, a 24-hour urine protein collection is not a very pleasant thing that all of us would like to do. A patient has to necessarily take leave on that particular day, be away from work, and then collect the can, and then start collecting all the urine that they pass in 24 hours in a can, and then bring it to the laboratory. So this is a cumbersome procedure. So to circumvent this cumbersome procedure, there is a procedure called the urine protein creatinine ratio. A sample of urine is taken, the protein and the creatinine is estimated. This is very convenient because it's an OP procedure. It can be done in the lab and the patient can come in. Suppose the urine PC ratio is 1, it equates to 1 gram of protein. As I told you, the normal protein excretion is 150 milligrams per day. So if the PCR is 2, the urine PCR, you interpret it as 2 grams per 24 hours. If it is 10, it gives 10 grams per 24 hours. So a 24-hour urine protein excretion can be easily done when the patient is hospitalized, but as an outpatient procedure, it's cumbersome for the patient. And the urine spot protein creatinine ratio is one ideal way of estimating the degree of proteinuria. Again, the pH can give you a clue to many diagnoses like renal tubular acidosis. The normal pH is about 4.5 to 8. The early morning pH is about 5.3 to 5.5. That means that the distal tubular acidification is intact. So there are certain diseases like which present as hypokalemia or in the infant as failure to thrive. This can be diagnosed by just looking at the urine pH. Urine specific gravity could also give you, can also give you important clues as to the concentration of urine. Somebody is well hydrated would have a low specific gravity. Somebody is having serious volume depletion would have a very high specific gravity. Osmolality, of course, is not done routinely. Osmolality is particularly useful in certain diseases like diabetes insipidus. Of course, that requires special laboratory and setups to do. The other thing is glucose in the urine. You know, the renal glucose threshold is about 180 milligrams. If the blood sugar is normal, the patient is not a diabetic, and if there's glucose in the urine, one is that could be a proximal tubular dysfunction because glucose is handled in the proximal tubule. So what we call it as a proximal RTA or a Fanconi syndrome could be there, or rare diseases like renal glycosuria that could give rise to glucose in the urine. Please remember the new group of drugs, the SGLT2 inhibitors like canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, all these act by excreting a lot of glucose in the urine, and that is how they reduce the blood sugar. So patients on these drugs could have glucose in the urine. So this could be the result of the pharmacological therapeutic maneuver that one is employing on the patient. So you could have somebody whose sugars are well controlled with either a combination of metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors, can have a near normal blood sugar, and you find urine sugar, then you know that this is because of glycosuria is because of the SGLT2 inhibitors. Looking at the sediment of the urine is very, very important because this is akin to a poor man's kidney biopsy. We call urine as liquid gold because it gives us so much of information before going for other sophisticated tests like an ultrasound or an MRI or a CT. It gives us so many clues if it is done properly and interpreted properly. So there could be. Sorry, sir. Is it okay?
No, okay, sir. No, okay, sir.
So the cells of the sediment could be either RBCs, it can be WBCs, it could be renal tubular epithelial cells, some squamous cells, and uroepithelial cells. Now, looking at RBCs in the sediment requires a very good technician because if somebody's got gross hematuria, then you know it's very easy. But for patients who have microscopic hematuria, it's very, very difficult because RBCs are quite small and it requires a technician who has to look diligently by spinning the urine and then looking it under the microscope. Because a microscopic hematuria could give you a clue that there is an underlying glomerulonephritis, especially particular types of RBCs like the dysmorphic RBCs or certain types of dysmorphic RBCs called the acanthocytes could be very sensitive and a specific marker of glomerular disease. IgA nephropathy is a common disease that many patients of CKD in this country do have, and this is diagnosed by intermittent microscopic macrohematuria or persistent microscopic hematuria. Again, the commonest cause of this hematuria is a urinary tract infection. And never interpret hematuria in somebody who's catheterized. When you catheterize urethra, there are likely to be RBCs in the urine. So make sure that the sample is not from a catheterized patient because RBCs can be formed. Make sure the lady patient is not menstruating because very easily contamination could happen and give you an erroneous impression. The commonest cause of hematuria is a urinary tract infection. This is what I mentioned about the different types of acanthocytes, and if there are dysmorphic RBCs in the urine, then that gives you a clue to underlying glomerular diseases. Now, you will have to spin the urine after doing the tests for the dipstick as well as the you look at dipstick and look at the protein, glucose, etc. So you'll have to look at the urinary sediment. You'll have to take you use a good pipette and take out the sediment and then place it under the Nubar chamber cover to the cover slip and examine in the low par and high par. Low par and high par. So here the casts tend to accumulate around the corners of the cover slip. So one has to concentrate and look at the corners of the cover slip. We always tell our DM trainees that you must do at least one urine sediment examination per week, and if necessary, even more when you encounter patients, and it's part of our long case that we include urine examination as part of the clinical examination. He has to do a urine examination in the laboratory and present it when he's presenting. So that is the importance that we give for the urine examination. The normal microscope is enough, but then there are phase contrast and polarized light microscopy, which could be used for specific instances. But a regular microscope that the site laboratory has, or any renal lab, any lab has, is enough to examine the urine. These are the RBCs. This is called microscopic hematuria. When you have more than 5 RBCs per high par field in a centrifuge specimen of urine, on more than 1 or 2 occasions, 2 or 3 occasions, you call it as microscopic hematuria. If there is dysmorphic RBCs, I mentioned, it means that there could be a glomerular disease. Isomorphic RBCs could be a renal cell carcinoma or a bladder malignancy that can give rise to hematuria. As I mentioned to you, picking up RBCs in the urine is actually tough because a lot of substances can look like RBCs. So yeast, sperm, air bubbles, fat droplets, some scratches on the slide, pollen, starch, etc. So that's why I said the technician should be well trained to pick up the RBCs. WBCs, generally only neutrophils we see. It can be found with UTI, acute interstitial nephritis, and graft rejections. And acute interstitial nephritis, eosinophiluria could be there. It was previously thought to be very pathognomonic. Now we don't believe that eosinophiluria is always there, but these are simple clues that can give you a diagnosis. This is renal tubular cells that can be found. Renal tubular epithelial cells or dirty brown casts can be seen. These are normal cells that can be seen, which are shed. This is WBCs. You can see the arrow here shows the cluster of WBCs. They're all they're larger in size compared to the RBC. They are larger in size. You can see the nucleus and you can see the cytoplasmic granules. These are all RBCs in the urine. These are squamous epithelial cells and these are urothelial cells. So if you look at the diameter just given here below, bacteria looks this, RBC is next smallest, WBC is bigger, the tubular epithelial cell is much bigger, transitional epithelial cell is bigger, and the largest cell is the squamous epithelial cell. So this is how they all look like, RBC, WBCs, and the tubular epithelial cells. Casts are nothing but when these substances pass through the tubules, they take a mold of the tubule and they are found as casts. Again, casts should be examined. You shouldn't spin the urine very much. The centrifuge should be only about 1,000 to 1,500 RPMs, and the casts tend to accumulate around the edges of the cover slip. If you spin it at higher speeds, the cast would disintegrate. A hyaline cast is a very common finding in urine examination, nothing to really get scared about, but a hyaline granular cast certainly needs to be looked into because it could be pathological. Waxy casts and fatty casts are seen in patients with proteinuria, typically the nephrotic syndrome, where it could be even pathognomonic of the disease. This is a RBC cast, very pathognomonic of glomerular disease. This is a WBC cast. So you can see the outline of the tubule, and on top of that, WBC is getting embedded. So this is seen in pyelonephritis, acute interstitial nephritis. This is a dirty brown cast of acute tubular necrosis. So again, for comparison, a hyaline cast can be a normal finding. This is an RBC cast, and this is a granular cast. So this is a waxy cast or a broad cast. A broad cast indicates that the tubule is dilated. Look at the width of this tubule. So these broad casts are very pathognomonic of CKD, chronic kidney disease. Then you can have bacteria in the cast, hemoglobin, myoglobin, or bilirubin. Recently, we had somebody who had a very high bilirubin due to some hepatitis and presented with acute renal failure. And the biopsy shows bile cast nephropathy. So there could be a combination of the casts also. It could be a hemoglobin and a granular cast together, a hyaline and a granular cast, or a waxy and a WBC cast also. As I mentioned, that hyaline cast clinical meaning is not very significant, while a granular, waxy, and RBC casts are definitely indicative of pathological disease, pathology. So again, telling you the importance of having a good urine examination. A leukocyte cast indicates renal inflammation, severe tubular damage due to epithelial cast could be because of ATN. Proteinuria most certainly means that this patient has a glomerular disease, and crystals could be pathognomonic of certain diseases at times. So we'll come to examination of the crystals. Again, this requires a good microscopy and a very trained technician. Oxalate crystals could be found occasionally in normal urine, but whenever there are a lot of oxalate crystals, one has to think of ethylene glycol intoxication. This is calcium phosphate crystals, usually secondary to infection. Uric acid crystals, very typical of very high levels of hyperuricemia, somebody having acute leukemia where there's breakdown of the purines, or when there is tumor lysis syndrome. When you start chemotherapy, there's a breakdown of the solid organ tumors. So this can be the uric acid crystalluria. These are amorphous phosphate crystals, and these are triple phosphate crystals, sometimes called as coffin lid appearance or razor blade appearance. So these are again could be caused by the urea splitting bacteria. Cystine crystals are very pathognomonic of cystinuria. So these are hexagonal crystals, yellow-shaped crystals. It's found in acidic urine, and this patient could have renal tubular acidosis, and they can have abnormality in the cystine metabolism. So this is a typical oxalate crystal. The envelope shape, you can see it as an envelope shape oxalate crystal. This is uric acid crystals, ammonium urate, and this is triple phosphate, the coffin lid crystals. This is cystine and this is uric acid. So the polarized light enables the differentiation between cystine and uric acid crystals. Rarely cholesterol crystals could be seen, bilirubin crystals or tyrosine. These are a little rare, calcium carbonate, ammonium carbonate. Certain drugs could give rise to crystalluria. These are certain drugs like sulfadiazine, large doses. This is moxicillin crystals. Of course, these are all very rare. Ciprofloxacin. Certain bacteria could be seen. These are certain parasites could be seen in the urine, like Schistosoma, hematobium, of course, a rare disease for this part of the country. Of course, in women, since the vagina is very close by, you could find some Trichomonas vaginalis or B. coli in the urine, Candida, etc. So there could be a lot of contaminants. One has to make sure that this is done in a very appropriate way. The laboratory itself could be a source of contamination. The environment, it could be contaminated. That is why the urine has to be examined immediately after it is collected. You can see sperms here in this urine, some clot fibers, glass bits, pollen, starch, synthetic fiber. These are things that can contaminate the urine. So I'm now reminded of Robert Hutchison, who said the ghosts of dead patients that haunt us do not ask us why we did not employ the latest fad of clinical investigation. They may ask us why you did not test my urine. These are some artifacts that can be found. And as I said, a nephrologist looking at a urine specimen compared to a lab technician makes a huge difference in the management because a lab technician has no idea about what this patient has. For him, it is 100 samples of urine and he just routinely starts giving reports. While a clinician examines a patient and then collects the urine. So you could obviously see the very gross difference. This is a study published. You could obviously see the gross difference that the nephrologist made while the nephrologist examined the urine and look at a diagnostic accuracy of 34% and 92%. So this should not be considered a technical job at all. It should be part of our clinical examination. And whenever you ask for an investigation, make sure why you are asking for this investigation, because you're unlikely to find something that you do not know. So the eyes don't see what the mind does not know. And hence, make sure what exactly you want to benefit out of this investigation. Why do you ask for this investigation? Then you'll be able to interpret it to the patient. So with this, let me conclude here. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you once again for the opportunity of speaking.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was a nice presentation, sir. So far, we are seeing only urine albumin deposits, only that two things. Now only we recognize that a lot of things we have to see and understand from urine examination. We can go for the discussion part. You can ask questions for both the speakers. You can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask the questions.
So before that, I would like to tell one thing.
Yes, sir.
Sir, Professor Edwin, sir, thank you, sir, for the beautiful presentation. I never thought that a urine is so beautiful, sir.
Sir, for Dr. Manisurya Kumar, sir, one question. Sir, you said cutaneous larva migrants, you put one picture.
Yes.
Is how often it is seen in the OP, sir? Because we have read it in books and we have seen it only in pictures. How often it is it frequently seen or it is rarely seen, sir?
It is not a very common condition like scabies, but at least in our derm OPD in Stanley, we are encountering at least one case per day. One case per day, we are daily seeing one case, but it's not so common like scabies or fungal infections. So the image what I showed is one of the picture of the patient who came to our OPD in Stanley. It's not so common like scabies, but at least one patient in a day we see.
Okay. Sir, Dr. Edwin, sir, you repeatedly told to look at the corners of the edges of the cover slip, sir. What does that mean, sir? What is the significance, sir?
So the casts tend to migrate towards the edges of the cover slip. You're just trying to do, you put a drop of water on a slide and then you put a cover slip on top. You see how the water gets displaced. So the formed elements tend to accumulate at the edges of the cover slip. So when you examine the specimen, if you look at a slide under a microscope, you will avoid going to the edges because you want to see the center part, because the edges may not be very clear. But here the casts tend to, the formed elements in the urine tend to accumulate at the edges of the cover slip. So if you look at only the center part, you can very easily miss these formed elements. So that is what I meant to say. Now with automated urine analysis, the problem is most laboratories now have automated urine analysis. So you just push in a drop of urine and you will get a printout. Now this printout will give you glucose, protein, specific gravity, nitrates, leukocyte esterase, blood. So about 8 components it gives out. Now, in order to get more details in a particular patient in whom you suspect a renal disease, one has to do a microscopy. Now, so this urine should not be discarded. This urine should be kept in the laboratory so that in case the clinician wants, he can ask for a urine microscopy or probably go and look at the urine himself. we insist that all our nephrology trainees do it themselves. Because otherwise, the laboratory just gives you a printout of this report. They will type that printout and then give it to you. So this will say blood 2+. Now this blood 2+ may be RBCs or maybe some hemoglobinuria. This patient could have a hemolytic disease, and that shows a false positivity for blood in the dipstick. Now, how do you confirm whether this is just hemoglobinuria or myoglobinuria or hematuria? Now, for this, urine microscopy is very essential. So that is what I said. You must know what test your lab is doing. Suppose a lab is doing creatinine, you must know what methodology they use. Do they use an enzymatic methodology? Do they use a calorimetry? Do they do the Jaffe's reaction, etc.? So it's very, very important, especially, of course, I can't expect every specialist to know what their lab is doing. But people who are looking after patients with kidney disease should definitely know, because we are a specialty where the lab plays a very, very important role, because we look at figures. Though we look at the patient clinically, we of course have to look at the figures. So a urine microscopy, certain labs will do a sulfosalicylic acid test. They'll take urine in the test tube, add sulfosalicylic acid, report the protein. Then they will do the Benedict's test and report the glucose. And then they will do the urine microscopy and give it as deposits. So this is albumin, sugar deposits. Now, if you look at a dipstick, the dipstick gives you 8 components. But then a dipstick and a microscopic examination have to be complementary to each other. So if you find your urine report as 2+ blood, leukocyte esterase plus, nitrate plus, then this lab has used an automated urine analyzer. If your lab is reporting urine protein, urine sugar, urine deposits, then they're doing it manually. But the urine microscopy should be combined with the dipstick to give a higher yield to the clinician in terms of diagnosis.
Sir, one of my patients, culture sensitivity showed a sterile pyuria. How to proceed with this patient?
The commonest cause of culture negativity is us. We start antibiotics before we send a culture. So that is the first thing that one must look at. It may not be possible for us to get a culture report and start treating, but at least insist that please give the test for culture and then start taking antibiotics. So this is the commonest mistake that we make, is when the blood cultures are negative or the urine culture is negative or some culture is negative, we tend to blame the laboratory. However, we must see whether we have done it the right way or the patient has followed the instruction clearly. So if this is done, then your yield of getting an organism is high. So sterile pyuria should be interpreted with a lot of caution, because classically a sterile pyuria can be seen in patients who have been treated not adequately, or genitourinary tuberculosis typically causes a sterile pyuria. And there are a host of other conditions where sterile pyuria could be there. So it has to be interpreted with a lot of caution.
But we have to repeat the culture, sir?
Ideally, yes, because if you're dealing, especially if you're dealing with a diabetic
patient, symptomatic is there, sir. Symptomatic.
Yeah. If the patient is a diabetic and you have completed 2 weeks of parenteral antibiotics, it is better to repeat the culture. A diabetic could have a neurogenic bladder, which could predispose him to develop repeated urinary tract infection because of stasis of urine in the bladder. Or we could have some other abnormalities like a papillary necrosis or a stone or fungal UTIs, which could give rise to repeated UTI. UTI causes a lot of morbidity and mortality, especially in elderly and in diabetics. And in the young, any urinary tract infection should be investigated vigorously, because especially a male child developing a UTI should be looked into very, very seriously for some anatomic abnormalities. Elderly people with the prostate and related problems should the lower urinary tract should be paid a lot of attention to.
Dr. Mani sir, the elderly people are complaining itching all over the body
Yes, sir.
without any lesion or anything.
Yes.
So what could be the main reason, sir?
Sir,
Without diabetes or anything?
no, sometimes even without diabetes or renal involvement or liver involvement, the patient can present with pruritus. So it will be the most common
Generalized.
old age. The old age is because of the skin atrophy, sir. As the age increases, the skin goes for atrophy. So the free nerve endings, they get easily exposed to the environmental triggers. So it presents as itching. So you should try to keep the skin moist. So liberal use of moisturizers will help in old age patients with pruritus. It is mainly due to the skin atrophy, which exposes the free nerve endings to the external trigger factors.
Which moisturizers are best?
If the brand names are permitted, Cetaphil and Venusia Max, they are the best moisturizers currently available in the market.
Now they are all adding aloe vera and other things.
Yes, sir. Many, nearly 100 to 150 products are available, sir. But the best one are Cetaphil, international companies, sir. Venusia, again from Dr. Reddy's international company. They are very good moisturizers.
Thank you, sir.
In continuation with Shankaran sir's question there, because this is a common scenario we frequently see with elderly patients. Whatever drug we give, the patient will continuously say itching.
Next
So
time
how practically to manage
after stopping the drug, they will come.
Yes, sir.
You should try to
Yes, sir.
That's the problem.
Definitely you have to rule out the underlying cause.
Because they say it is some people they say they attempt the severity of itching. So how about antihistamines, sir? Shall we take it for a long time? Is there any cutoff for that, or we can use any steroids, low dose of steroids? Is it okay like that, sir? For that old age intractable itching, what to do, sir?
No, sir. Just only pruritus, no skin lesions. I don't think there is any role for oral steroids, sir. Oral steroids don't have any role, sir. Just oral antihistamines. You can give for a long period, but frequently you have to assess for renal involvement. But you can give, sir. You can give antihistamines like CPM, chlorpheniramine, hydroxyzine at the night time, and you can give a non-sedating antihistamine like cetirizine in the morning times.
Atarax will be effective, sir.
It's very effective in the night time, sir. It gives a very good relief. Sedative antihistaminics in the night time and non-sedative antihistaminics in the morning.
Thank you.
The problem with the antihistamines is, it's a commonly available over-the-counter prescription.
Yes.
And there are a lot of antihistamines in the long run, especially in the elderly people. They could give rise to arrhythmias.
Arrhythmias, yes.
So more than renal involvement, I'm more worried about arrhythmias in elderly people.
Yes, there is patients with prolonged QT prolongation. Tarsitis depointis has been.
Yeah, very cleverly, the industry has not highlighted this side effect at all. They will only say non-sedating antihistamine, etc. But these could be quite dangerous in patients, elderly who are already on drugs, cardiac drugs. And so this could be a problem because it's again over-the-counter prescription in our country. So anybody could just go to the pharmacy and get an antihistamine. So one has to be very careful with that.
The risk of QT prolongation is very high.
Sir, Mani sir, any soap, sir? Frequently patient is asking for a soap for this itching. Any particular soap or something, any role for that preventing itching?
Soaps are available, sir. Moisturizing soaps are available, which we can. Hard soaps you should avoid, sir. Moisturizing soaps. Many brands are available in the market. In the old age patients with severe itching, moisturizing soaps will definitely benefit, sir. Liberal use of moisturizers. Use of moisturizers at least 3 to 4 times a day will definitely give symptomatic improvement along with moisturizing soaps. You should try to ask them to avoid sweating, hot climate.
Okay, sir. Sir,
soaps alone won't help, sir. It's a combination therapy.
So a question for Dr. Edwin, sir, from the chat box. Sir, how to differentiate the hematuria due to nephrological cause or urological cause, sir, from urine examination?
Yes. See, for example, somebody has a bladder malignancy or a renal cell carcinoma. They present with frank hematuria. If you look at the RBCs under the microscope, they have what is known as isomorphic RBCs. So all these RBCs are of same size, and there's no alteration in the shape. So whenever there is a glomerular disease and these RBCs leak through the capillaries, they get crenated. So they get distorted. So these are called dysmorphic RBCs. There are many types of dysmorphic RBCs, one of which is called acanthocytes. Acanthocytes are nothing but an RBC with cytoplasmic blebs. It's described as RBC with Mickey Mouse ears. So you can just imagine an RBC with some cytoplasmic projection. So this can be well studied with the good microscope or a phase contrast microscope. So it is said that if you have 100 dysmorphic RBCs and 5 acanthocytes are present, your sensitivity and specificity for a diagnosis of glomerulonephritis is much higher. So isomorphic versus dysmorphic erythrocyturia, and among the dysmorphic erythrocyturia, acanthocytes. So this is a very important way where we can look at clinically. Before you go for, of course, you'll have to look at imaging and all other things to confirm your diagnosis. And whenever there is a glomerular disease, there is always associated proteinuria. So when there is no proteinuria and only RBCs, again, you don't think of a glomerular disease. Of course, disease like IgA nephropathy can present with a microscopic hematuria alone, but there should be some amount of protein. No proteinuria and hematuria would always indicate you that this is more of a urological cause.
One more question, sir. Pus cells more than 10 in urine, but patient is asymptomatic. How to treat?
Again, WBCs in the urine can be because of multiple causes. One is common is urinary tract infection. Patients on steroids, patients with acute interstitial nephritis, transplant patients treated for rejection. So there are multiple causes for pyuria. More than 5 RBCs per high power field will more than demonstrate or more than 2 or 3 occasions is pyuria. So if the patient has pyuria, one is they could be symptomatic or asymptomatic. For example, there may be a group of patients like transplant recipients who could have UTI but may not be showing symptoms. Somebody who is immunosuppressed otherwise with HIV or been on patients being treated by chemotherapy, they could not have clinical manifestations and still have a lot of WBCs. So when you have WBCs in the urine or pus cells in the urine, go through the list of conditions that could cause this. Even if there's no symptom, definitely you'll have to look at a urine culture. And if there's something growing there, then you'll have to treat.
Sir, 24-hour urine protein examination and spot protein creatinine.
Yes.
How exactly the correlation is?
Correlation is fairly good. A lot of studies have shown that this is fairly okay. So to measure a 24-hour urine protein, you'll have to instruct the patient. He has to collect a can from the laboratory. They add some preservatives and they give the can. So the patient has to go home and then get up in the morning, first sample of urine to be discarded in the toilet. And from the second sample, let's say he gets up at 7, his first sample of urine is discarded. The next sample of urine starts at 9 o'clock. So from 9 a.m. of this day to 9 a.m. of the next day, he has to collect all the urine and then bring it to the laboratory. Now, this is a cumbersome process. I'm sure that none of us would like to sit and collect our urine in cans. So in order to circumvent this urine protein, spot urine protein creatinine ratio was done and compared with the 24-hour urine protein and found to be reasonably good. So most of us in our clinical practice, we go by a urine protein creatinine ratio. Of course, for academic reasons and in a teaching hospital like ours, and sometimes patients may be asking us for documentation there is reduction of proteinuria, then a 24-hour urine protein is essential. In a hospitalized patient, of course, collecting 24-hour urine protein is relatively easy than sitting at home and collecting 24 hours urine. So this correlation is fairly good.
Okay. Sir, question to Dr. Mani, sir. Itching without skin lesions, what skin test or blood test should be done?
Immediate blood test should be blood sugar level, sir. Blood sugar level, thyroid profile should be done. And peripheral smear, we have to look for peripheral smear to look for any eosinophils or atypical cells. These are the common investigations when a patient comes with itching without skin lesions. Even liver function test to rule out liver involvement, renal function test. These are the common tests. Mainly peripheral smear, sir. Peripheral smear will play a major role.
Itching after taking certain foods like non-veg, how to manage?
Desensitization therapy. The only available treatment is desensitization, but it's very cumbersome procedure. Most of the patients, they are not willing for desensitization therapy, and it is also only done in few centers in Chennai. Not everywhere the desensitization therapy is done, sir. The best thing, if it's one or two foods, the best thing is to avoid.
Okay.
To avoid that food. If the patient is complaining itching following many foods, then they have to go for desensitization therapies. The best thing is to avoid that food.
Okay. The role of NK antagonist in refractory itching conditions. Somebody asked about that. I don't know what is NK antagonist they are asking.
NK.
Yes, sir. NK antagonist.
NK. What, no, I didn't get that word.
What is NK? Okay.
Okay. Anybody want to ask? You can unmute and ask both the speakers. Sir, Dr. Edwin, sir, we had one case scenario, sir, where the patient is a diabetic, uncontrolled diabetic with proteinuria, which is not in the nephrotic range. So what the nephrologist suggested was he asked for a retinopathy screening, sir. So he said if the retinopathy is present, the proteinuria is due to nephropathy, and there is no need for biopsy. If it is normal, we can go for a biopsy. So what is your idea, sir, regarding the correlation between nephropathy and retinopathy in diabetics?
Okay. The majority of patients in our country are type 2 diabetics. In a patient with type 2 diabetes, you screen for complications like nephropathy at diagnosis itself. Because a lot of times we are diagnosing diabetes along with complications because diabetes was not picked up earlier, or the patient was told of diabetes and then was not compliant with therapy or diet. So if a diabetic, every year you must screen with your urine examination for presence of microproteinuria, or what earlier it was called microalbuminuria. Now it is just called proteinuria. So the ideal test to do for this patient is to look at a urine albumin creatinine ratio. This urine albumin creatinine ratio should be less than 30. If it is 30 to 300, it means it's moderately proteinuria, and more than 300 definitely indicates renal involvement. So in patients with type 2 diabetes, the correlation between nephropathy and retinopathy is about 40 to 60%. Which means that 40 to 60% of type 2 diabetics with nephropathy would have retinopathy. Now, presence of retinopathy in a patient with proteinuria in a diabetic would indicate that this diabetic nephropathy. However, absence of retinopathy does not rule out a nephropathy. As I mentioned, the correlation is only about 40 to 60%. In a type 1 diabetic, the correlation between nephropathy and retinopathy is nearly 90%. What you see in the retina as proliferative diabetic retinopathy or a pre-proliferative diabetic retinopathy tells you the status of the capillaries in the kidney also. The retina is just a window to the capillary system of the body. So somebody has proteinuria and retinopathy, then most probably these patients have diabetic nephropathy. The absence of retinopathy does not rule out nephropathy. However, if there are plenty of RBCs in the urine, massive proteinuria, the increase in creatinine does not correlate with the disease, or you find a rapidly increasing creatinine, then these are indications where you can biopsy a diabetic and then see other causes of kidney disease in a diabetic. So all diabetics, it is not necessary that diabetic nephropathy alone is a disease. There could be some superadded glomerulonephritis. They could have a diabetic non-healing foot ulcer that could get infected and produce an infection-related glomerulonephritis on top of a diabetic nephropathy. They could have other glomerular diseases that could overlap on top of a diabetic kidney disease. So the decision to biopsy a diabetic is based on all these parameters.
Thank you.
More recently,
Edwin, just one question, Edwin.
Yes, sir.
You are all in the medical college like Mutthumani. Do you have still the microscope in the wards for the house surgeons or the PGs to examine? Do you insist, like how they insisted in our days? Do they insist in the house surgeon or the PGs doing the motion urine examination? The ward, is the microscope still available in the wards?
Unfortunately, it is not being insisted upon. In a nephrology unit, we always insist on the urine examination and the sediment examination. As you said, that this side lab has actually disappeared in many centers.
Because of the department, we have microscopes, sir. We have nearly 4 to 5 microscopes. Now, what Edwin sir presented in his topic, he told that there is a difference in the interpretation between the technicians and the specialists. So when the specialists look into the slide, the diagnosis will become more easy. Many times we send the skin scraping for a fungus examination to the lab, but the result comes as negative. But when we examine the patient, it is classically a fungal infection. So what we do is we ask our postgraduates to do the scraping and we ask them to examine. We also examine under the microscope. So definitely we will be able to catch up the fungus more than the technicians. Still we have microscopes, sir, in our department, and it has become a routine. We have a side labs.
What Dr. Ashraf was mentioning was, in earlier days, there used to be a side lab in every medicine department where we used to do the urine sugar and urine ketone and not depend on the central laboratory. However, that practice has actually disappeared. Unfortunately, yes.
Sir, Dr. Edwin, sir, is it possible for a diabetic nephropathy per se to have hematuria, sir?
Yes, possible. Possible. I did not say that because the larger interest, we teach our students that up to 20% of diabetics could have a hematuria. They could have. But the presence of RBCs in a diabetic should alert the physician that there could be something else in addition. As I said, we have to put everything together before you decide on a biopsy. And more recently, a diabetic nephropathy is classically proteinuria, edema, hypertension, and worsening GFR. This is a classical diabetic nephropathy. In recent times, the terminology has been now changed to diabetic kidney disease, which means that proteinuria need not essentially be present. Number one, 50% of diabetic kidney of renal failure due to diabetes is now not classical diabetic nephropathy. It is called diabetic kidney disease because it encompasses not only diabetic nephropathy, but also other causes of renal failure that could happen in a diabetic. For example, hypertension and hypertension-related diseases, repeated episodes of pyelonephritis that could compromise kidney function, patients taking drugs that could cause some interstitial nephritis. So now it is believed that 50% of diabetics could have what is known as normoalbuminuric diabetes, diabetic kidney disease. So now the umbrella terminology, diabetic kidney disease, includes diabetic nephropathy along with plus minus other things. When there's classic proteinuria, retinopathy, peripheral neuropathy, hypertension, worsening kidney disease, worsening creatinine, this is classical diabetic nephropathy.
Sir, urine microalbumin or urine spot PCR, which is better?
No, urine microalbuminuria is a terminology has been given up even by the ADA right now. Now, what is microalbuminuria? Microalbuminuria is 30 to 300 milligrams of albumin excretion per 24 hours. Now, to check for microalbuminuria, you need to have a micral dipstick, number one. Or number two, you have to do it by nephelometry or radioimmunoassay. These are the technologies available to check for microalbuminuria. Now, to check for microalbuminuria, one should not have smoked, should not have strenuous exercise, should have their hypertension under control, diabetes under control, lipids under control. Then you do this test 3 times in 6 months. And if you find 2 of this is positive, you call it as microalbuminuria. Now, the criteria that I mentioned, as practitioners, all of you would know that these are extremely difficult to follow all these criteria before you check for microalbumin. So urine albumin creatinine ratio is an ideal test to screen for diabetic kidney disease in a diabetic. So this is the simplest test that is available and a sensitive test also.
Okay. On question to Dr.
And the other common mistake that I see is when somebody's got gross proteinuria, let us say the urine albumin is 2 plus 3 plus, or the protein is 2 plus 3 plus. At this point, please don't ask for microalbumin. It doesn't make any sense. The patient has already had macroalbumin. So then the microproteinuria will come as 10,000 micrograms, and it creates panic in the minds of patients. That is a very huge number, because now the laboratory gives the result, it gives the normal values by the side. So they really panic. So if somebody's got gross proteinuria, then don't ask for microalbumin.
Okay. Dr. Mani sir, one question. Duration and dosage of antifungals for tinea.
Tinea, the maximum duration is 6 to 8 weeks, sir. Previously, it was considered as only 2 weeks. But now most of the fungal infections have become very recalcitrant and they are not responding to the conventional duration of treatment. So at least for 4 to 6 weeks. Even after the resolution of the lesions, the antifungals have to be continued for another 2 weeks. So the total duration has now been increased to up to 6 weeks.
Dr. Mani sir, what would be the reason for premature gray hair for children?
Sir, premature gray hair, mainly nutritional, sir. Mainly nutritional deficiency. And sometimes it could be genetic, hereditary, they are hereditary. Mainly, we have to rule out the nutritional cause, sir. Good nutritional supplementation and genetic causes we have to rule out, sir.
Which nutrients are more important?
Biotin, calcium pantothenate, and all essential minerals, sir.
Sir, can we start all patients with clotrimazole, or directly you have to go for higher topical antifungals like terbinafine? So what is your idea? Whether
Terbinafine is fungicidal.
Okay, sir.
Clotrimazole is fungistatic.
Okay,
so definitely you can go for terbinafine, which is a fungicidal agent. So fungicidals are always better than fungistatics. So directly you can start with topical terbinafine. See, sir, the difference. See, when there is only single patch, go for topical therapy. If there are 2 or more patches, you have to start a systemic drug, sir. Either itraconazole or terbinafine.
Okay, sir. So fluconazole, sir, for oral fluconazole.
Fluconazole is a good drug, sir. I'm not refusing it, but it takes a longer time. The duration of treatment, it takes a longer time. And it has more side effects compared to itraconazole. Itraconazole is little less side effects and it can be given for a shorter duration. But fluconazole needs longer duration of treatments.
What is the duration for terbinafine, sir? Oral terbinafine.
Terbinafine, the dosage is 250 milligrams, sir. Sometimes you can increase it up to 500 milligram per day.
How long, sir?
Dosage is 500 milligram per day. You can give for 4 to 6 weeks.
Sir, at what point of time you request us to refer to the dermatologist?
Sir,
So
you have started the patient on a topical antifungal and systemic antifungal. Patient is not responding for more than 4 weeks. Definitely, you have to refer to a dermatologist.
Sir, Dr.
The main point again I want to stress is please don't use steroids, sir. Over the counter, many steroid combination creams are available. Please don't use them. Initially, they will show resolution, but later there will be an acute flare-up because of the localized suppression of immunity. So please don't use steroids. Only topical antifungals, systemic antifungals will definitely give good results within 4 to 6 weeks. But you should also advise them the that they should use a separate soap and a separate towel. Personal hygiene should be advised. They should avoid a tight clothing. They should take bath 2 to 3 times. And if there is any other person in the family who is having fungal infection, even they should be treated. All these is a combination therapy, sir, not only the drugs. Personal hygiene is very important.
Okay, sir. Sir, the classical, the itching and the excoriations in the web spaces in scabies.
Yes, sir.
Even if the web spaces are free without any excoriations, can we diagnose scabies?
We can diagnose as scabies. That is called scabies in clean individuals. Clean individuals means like healthcare professionals. We frequently wash our hands, so we maintain personal hygiene. So the classical presentation of web space involvement, excoriated papules, we won't see, sir. But there will be itching, nocturnal itching will be there. We can directly start the patient on anti-scabitic treatment. That is called scabies in clean individuals, like healthcare professionals. There won't be the web space involvement.
Okay, sir. Sir, Dr. Edwin, sir, at what creatinine level metformin can be continued, sir?
The recent guidelines say up to a GFR of about 30 mils, you can continue.
Okay.
Below that, no. Earlier it used to be 45 mils.
Okay.
Now
sir.
30 mils. Less than 30 mils, you wouldn't start.
Okay.
If it is less than 45 mils, you can half the dose and still continue.
Okay. Sir, how to evaluate a case of albuminuria, sir? This question, I think it's very big question. Already you have answered most of the one
No,
person has posed.
The presence of proteinuria indicates that there is a glomerular disease.
Okay.
The normal protein excretion in the urine is 150 milligrams per day, can go up to 300 milligrams in a pregnant individual. Any proteinuria more than 750 milligrams per day is definitely needs to be looked into. Less than that should be watched with a regular urine examination or development of edema or hypertension and a watch on the creatinine. So let's say somebody's got more than 750 milligrams of protein in the urine. Then this patient will have to image the kidneys to make sure that the kidney size is normal. The other accompaniments, presence of hypertension would indicate again that there is some kidney disease, or the sediment showing RBCs or WBCs or casts again gives you a clue that there could be underlying kidney disease. Now, make sure the patient is not a diabetic. If the patient is a diabetic, you know this most probably is diabetic kidney disease. You would not investigate further, but take care of the patient in terms of glycemic control, good blood pressure control, physical activity, stop smoking, and alcohol in moderation. So these are the things that you would advise. The other group of patients who are non-diabetics, look at secondary causes. For example, there's a condition called multiple myeloma where they could have tubular proteinuria, where there is excess of tubular protein made, the myeloma protein that's leaking into the urine. If there is no other cause evident, in a lady in the reproductive age group, a renal disease should alert you to a possibility of systemic lupus erythematosus or other secondary diseases. If you find a significant proteinuria and the patient is not a diabetic, no obvious secondary causes, then the ideal thing will be to biopsy the kidney and look it under the microscope and then decide what is a particular kidney disease that he or she has. Is there any other etiology for this? And then treat the disease accordingly.
Okay, sir. So, Dr. Mani, sir, any dietary advice for eczema?
Eczema related to diet is very rare, sir. Eczema, definitely there will be an exposure to any allergen, any contact allergen. For example, if there is eczema over the face, it could be due to the cosmetics or the kungumam or the ear studs which they use, nose studs which they use, or lipsticks. So like that, it depends upon the eczema, which site is involved and what is the triggering factor, sir. Food causing generalized eczema is very rare, sir. But you should try to avoid foods which may cause itching, because that itching can aggravate that eczema. So it is directly related like that. Directly food won't cause eczema. If any food is particularly causing itching in those patients, that particular food can be avoided, sir. But there is no specific food which causes eczema. If the patient is allergic to any food and it is causing itching, that food should be avoided so that the eczema won't get aggravated. Directly food is not related to eczema, sir. Mostly it is related to the chemicals, occupational. Mostly it is related to the occupation.
Okay. So management of nail fungus.
Nail fungus, definitely no role of topical therapy, sir. Directly you have got to go for systemic antifungals, either itraconazole or terbinafine. Instead of going for a daily treatment, you can go for pulse therapy. The normal doses of itraconazole is 200 milligram 1 OD. But pulse therapy, we give 200 milligram BD for 7 days in a week. Then we give a 3 weeks gap. For 3 weeks, we don't give any treatment. Then again, we repeat the dose 1 month later. Again, 200 milligram BD for 1 week. So that is called pulse therapy, sir. So the higher doses of drugs are given for a shorter duration at regular intervals. So 200 milligram OD for 7 days in a month. Like that, you can give 3 times, 3 pulses. Systemic antifungal is a drug of choice.
Okay, sir. Sir, how to treat and the duration of therapy in scrotal dermatitis in diabetics?
Scrotal dermatitis, mostly it is due to the secondary infection, or you have to examine the groins. In the groins, there will be a fungal infection. So definitely you have to treat the fungal infection and the scrotal eczema. Scrotal eczema, you have to give antibiotics, but you have to carefully examine for any fungal infection nearby. So definitely there will be an underlying fungal infection in the groin area. So you have to treat the fungal infection also, and you have to start the patient on antibiotics. Topical moisturizers, topical antibiotics can be given. Specific duration we cannot mention, sir. It will depend. At least 2 to 3 weeks it will take, sir.
Okay, sir. So advice for patient with toenail fungal infection who wear shoes in summer days.
See, definitely ill-fitting shoes, the shoes with the sharp edge, those kind of shoes should be avoided, because it will cause severe occlusion and humidity, and that will itself aggravate you see, if there is more humidity, you are giving a environment for the fungus to grow. So avoid those ill-fitting shoes, those shoes with the sharp pointed edges. Use shoes with the broad edges. So that will prevent the fungal infection of the nails.
Okay, sir. So anybody want to ask any questions? Okay, sir, one final question to Dr. Edwin, sir. ARB at what level of creatinine allowed, sir?
Conventionally, when we talk to family practitioners and physicians, we tell them that 3 to 3.5 creatinine you could use an ACE inhibitor or an ARB. Now, the problem is why we don't recommend beyond this. One is danger of hyperkalemia, because patients with, as the GFR goes down, the chances of somebody developing hyperkalemia becomes higher. ARBs, as a side effect, do cause hyperkalemia. The way they act, they block the renin-angiotensin system, and that causes hyperkalemia. So these are the two issues. If the patient is under specialist care, then there need not be a higher limit of creatinine. Somebody coming to me, and if I am convinced that this patient would be regular with these drugs, will be regular checking in electrolytes and then reporting back to me, I would still continue these drugs if I find them beneficial. Because the only 2 drugs that have shown to reduce the proteinuria have been ACE inhibitors and ARBs. They are wonderful drugs in the armamentarium of a physician and a diabetologist and a nephrologist. It's also been useful in other glomerular diseases to reduce the proteinuria. So it depends upon what sort of patient you're dealing with. If you have a compliant patient who understands the dangers of hyperkalemia and is ready to report to you as and when you require with electrolyte reports, then this patient you can definitely continue. We have many of our dialysis patients in whom there is resistant hypertension, and we continue to use ARBs or ACE inhibitors in this group of patients. We also know that all patients with kidney disease, especially diabetes, do have heart disease. And in this condition, also in heart disease, also, the advantages of ACE inhibitors and ARBs are well known. So since their benefits are more, but you have to be convinced about the sort of patient you're dealing with. And the other thing about is when you're prescribing an ACE inhibitor or ARB, don't combine both. It has been found there's no benefit of combining both. However, the side effects of combining both are very high, number one. Number two is adding an additive drug that could produce hyperkalemia. For example, adding aldactone, spironolactone. Spironolactone is also used, eplerenone, and very recently we have got Findrinone, which is not yet available in the market. So these are drugs that have shown a lot of benefit for cardiac patients in terms of ventricular remodeling and also prevents fibrosis in the kidney. So these are wonderful drugs, but a combination of these drugs is definitely detrimental to the patient because hyperkalemia doesn't give you time to react. Somebody dies in sleep, it's mostly because of hyperkalemia. So one has to be very careful with the sort of patient you're treating. Broadly, it could be said that up to 3.5, if the patient is tolerating an ACE inhibitor or an ARB with no evidence of hyperkalemia, and you're not added a drug that could cause hyperkalemia in addition to the ACE inhibitor or ARB, then you could continue. If you're in a remote place where the patient would not come to you regularly, has no money to do electrolytes frequently, then I would cut off these ACE inhibitors or ARBs and give them other drugs that control the hypertension. After all, I need a drug to control the hypertension. It could be even a nifedipine or a clonidine or a less expensive drug like an amlodipine, which I could use. So it depends on what sort of patient you're treating, what sort of setup you're working in. So it depends largely on that. As a broad outline, I would say anything more than 3.5 creatinine, be careful with the use of an ACE inhibitor or an ARB.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. We have come to the end of the session. And sir, Sivashankaran, sir, Muchilam. Okay, I call upon Dr. Prabhu to give the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, all. From Trichy API, I would like to thank Dr. Mani Suryakumar sir for his extensive discussion about every possible differential diagnosis of itchy patients, along with the clear indication of antifungals and steroids and its dose and its side effects, duration, and also its uses. Is throwing light on when not to use steroids in itchy patients. That's very useful, sir. Thank you very much, sir. And Dr. Edwin Pennanan, sir, thank you, sir, for his extensive lecture about how to collect urine, importance of urine examination, and its uses. And a special thanks to Dr. Arul Sundaresh Kumar, sir, from Tamil Nadu Medical Council for his participation in our meeting. I thank our participants for their active interaction and their patience. Finally, I thank Laya Life Sciences for their sponsorship. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sivashankaran, sir.
Thank you, Reddy, sir.
Thank you,
Mani,
Rasuf,
sir.
sir. Thank you, Rajshekhar, sir. Thank you, Gunasekaran, sir.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Both the speakers, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mudhumani. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mani, thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Money, thank you, money.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Which is the one correct one?